Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome all to today's reading from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Lila, chapter 16, verse number 78 onwards. We'll be reading today. Ukam karoti vachalam pangum langhate girim yat kripatam ham vande Shri Gurum Dinatarinam Paramananda Madhavam Sri Chaitanya Ishwaram Hari Om Tat Sat. लक्ष्मीर इवा अर्थालंकार उपमा प्रकाश आर अर्थालंकार आचे नाम virodhabhas. The use of the words Lakshmir Iva like Lakshmi manifests the ornament of meaning called Upama or the analogy. There is also the further ornament of meaning Virodhabhas or a contradictory indication. So as you know, we have been reading about how Keshav Kashmiri and Mahaprabhu, they were having this discussion on the composition on Ganges which Keshav Kashmiri had done. Verse number 79, Gangate Kamal Janme Sabar Subodh Kamale Gangar Janma Atyanta Virod. Everyone knows that lotus flowers grow in the water of the Ganges, but to say that the Ganges takes birth from a lotus flower seems extremely contradictory. Verse number 80, Ihan Vishnu Pad Padme Gangar Utpatti Virodhalankar Iha Maha Chamatkriti. So Mahaprabhu has just taken one verse and he's been doing the analysis of that verse, that how it had 4 good and 4 not so good points about it. The existence of Mother Ganges begins from the lotus feet of the Lord, although the statement that water comes from a lotus feet is a contradiction. In connection with Lord Vishnu, it is a great wonder. Verse number 81, Ishwara Achintya Shakte Gangar Prakash Ihate Virodha Nahi Virodha Abhas. In this birth of the Ganges by the inconceivable potency of the Lord, there is no contradiction, although it appears contradictory. Purport: the central point of all Vaishnava philosophy is to accept the inconceivable potency of Lord Vishnu. What sometimes appears contradictory from a material viewpoint is understandable in connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because he can perform contradictory activities by dint of his inconceivable potencies. Modern scientists are puzzled. They cannot even explain how such a large quantity of chemicals has formed the atmosphere. Scientists explain that water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, but when asked where such a large quantity of hydrogen and oxygen came from and how they combined to manufacture the great oceans and seas, they cannot answer, because they are atheists who will not accept that everything comes from life. Their thesis is that life comes from matter. Where do all these chemicals come from? The answer is that they are produced by the inconceivable energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Living entities are part of the Supreme Godhead, and from their bodies come many chemicals. For example, the lemon tree is a living entity that produces many lemons, and within each lemon is a great deal of citric acid. Therefore, if even an insignificant living entity who is but a part of the Supreme Lord can produce so much of a chemical, how much potency there must be in the body of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Scientists cannot perfectly explain where the chemicals of the world are manufactured, but one can explain this perfectly by accepting the inconceivable energy of the Supreme Lord. There is no reason for denying this argument, since there are potencies in the living entities who are samples of the personality of Godhead. How much potency there must be in the Supreme Godhead himself, as described in the Vedas, Nityo Nityanam Chetanash Chetananam. He is the chief eternal of all eternals and the chief living entity among all living entities. This is from Kathopanishad 2.2.13. Unfortunately, atheistic science will not accept that matter comes from life. Scientists insist upon their most illogical and foolish theory that life comes from matter, although this is quite impossible. They cannot prove in their laboratories that matter can produce life, yet there are thousands and thousands of examples illustrating that matter comes from life. Therefore, in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says that as soon as one accepts the inconceivable potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, No great philosopher or scientist can put forward any thesis to contradict the Lord's power. This is expressed in the following Sanskrit verse. Verse number 82. Ambujam ambuni jatam kvachid api na jatam ambujad ambu mura bhidi tad viparitam padam bhojan maha nadi jat. Ambujam is lotus flower and ambuni is the water. Jatam is grown and mura bhidi is in Krishna the killer of the Murasur. Pad Ambojat is from the lotus flower of his feet. Mahanadi, the great river, Jat has grown. Everyone knows that lotus flower grows in the water, but water never grows from a lotus. All such contradictions, however, are wonderfully possible in Krishna. The great river Ganga has grown from his lotus feet. Verse number 83. Gangar Mahatva Sadhya Sadhana Tahar Vishnu Padopatti Anuman Alankar. The real glory of Mother Ganges is that she has grown from the lotus feet of Lord Vishnu. Such hypothesis is another ornament called Anuman. Verse 84. Sthula e panch dosha panch alankar sukshma vicharye yadi ache apar. I have simply discussed the 5 gross faults and 5 literary embellishments of this verse, but if we consider it in fine detail, we will find unlimited faults. Verse number 85. Pratibha kavitva tomar devta prasade avichar kavye avashya pade dosh badhe. You have achieved poetic imagination and ingenuity by the grace of your worshipable demigod, but poetry not well reviewed is certainly subject to criticism. Verse number 86. Vichari kavitva kaile hayar sunirmal Salankar haile arth kare jhalamal. Jhalamal is dazzle. Poetic skill used with due consideration is very pure, and with metaphors and analogies it is dazzling. Verse number 87. Shunya prabhura vyakhya digvijay vismita mukhe na nihasre vakya pratibha stambhita. After hearing the explanations of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the champion poet was struck with wonder. His cleverness turned. He could not say anything. Verse 88. Kahite chahai kichu na aise uttara tabe vichare mane ha iya fanafara. Fanafara is puzzled. He wanted to say something, but no reply would come from his mouth. He then began to consider this puzzle within his mind. Verse number 89. Puruya balaka kaila mor buddhi lopa jani saraswati more kariyachena kopa. This mere boy has blocked my intelligence. I can therefore understand that Mother Saraswati has become angry with me. Purport. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is clearly said that all intelligence comes from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is situated in everyone's heart as the Paramatma. The Paramatma gave the Pandit the intelligence to understand that because he was proud of his learning and wanted to defeat even the Supreme Lord, by the will of the Lord and through the agency of Mother Saraswati, he had been defeated. One should not therefore be too proud of one's position. Even if one is greatly learned scholar, if he commits an offense to the lotus feet of the Lord, he will not be able to speak properly, in spite of his learning. In every aspect we are controlled. Our only duty, therefore, is to surrender always to the lotus feet of the Lord and not be falsely proud. Mother Saraswati created this situation to favor the champion Pandit so that he might surrender unto Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Verse number 90. ये व्याख्या करिला ये मनुष्येरा नहे शक्ति निमानी मुखे रही बलि आपने सरस्वती. The wonderful explanation the boy has given could not have been possible for a human being. Therefore, Mother Saraswati must have spoken personally through his mouth. Verse 91. Eta bhavi kahe shuna nimani pandita tava vyakhya shuni ami Ilan Vismita. Thinking thus, the Pandit said, My dear my Pandit, please hear me. Hearing your explanation, I am simply struck with wonder. Verse 92. Alankar nahi pada nahi शास्त्राभ्यास के माने ए सब अर्थ करीले प्रकाश. I am surprised you are not a literary student and do not have long experience in studying the Shastras. How have you been able to explain all these critical points? Verse 93. Iha shuni Mahaprabhu ati bada rangi tanha hriday jani kahe kari bhangi. Hearing this and understanding the Pandit's heart, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu replied in a humorous way. Verse 94. Shastrera vichar bhal mand nahi jani Saraswati ye balaya se bali bani. My dear sir, I do not know what is good composition and what is bad, but whatever I have spoken must be understood to have been spoken by Mother Saraswati. Verse 95. Iha shuni digvijay karila nischay shishu dware devi more kaila parajay. When he heard this judgment from Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the Pandit sorrowfully wondered why Mother Saraswati wanted to defeat him through a small boy. Verse 96. Aji tanre nive diba kari jap dhyan shishu dware kaila more eta apman. Eta means so much. I shall offer prayers and meditation to the goddess of learning, the champion concluded, and ask her why she has insulted me so greatly through this boy. Verse 97. Vastuta Saraswati Ashuddha Shloka Karaila Vichara Samay Tandra Buddhi Achadila. Saraswati had in fact induced the champion to compose his verse in an impure way. Furthermore, when it was discussed, she recovered his intelligence, and thus the Lord's intelligence was triumphant. Verse 98. Tabe Shishya Gana Sabe Hasite Lagila Ta Sabha Nishedhi Prabhu Kavire Kahila. When the poetic champion was thus defeated, all the Lord's disciples sitting there began to laugh loudly, but Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu asked them not to do so, and he addressed the poet as follows. Verse 99. Tumi bada pandit mahakavi shiromani yandra mukhe bahirai aiche kavya bani. You are the most learned scholar and the topmost of all great poets, for otherwise how could such fine poetry come from your mouth? Verse 100. Tomar kavitva yena ganga jaladhar toma sama kavi kotha nahi dekhi ar. Your poetic skill is like the constant flow of the water of the Ganges. I find no one in the world who can compete with you. Verse 101. Bhavabhuti Jayadeva ar Kalidas tan sabar kavitve ache dosher prakash. Even in the poetic composition of such great poets as Bhavabhuti, Jayadeva and Kalidas, there are many examples of fault. Verse number 102. Doshakuna vichara e alpa kariman kavitva karane shakti tanhe se wakhani. Kavitva is the poetic ingenuity. Such mistakes should be considered negligible. One should see only how such poets have displayed their poetic power. Purport in Srimad Bhagavatam 1.5.11, it is said, Tadvag visargo janatagha viplavo yasmin prati shlokam adadhavati api namani anantasya yasho anikitani yat shinvanti gayanti grinanti sadhavaha. In explaining the glories of the Lord, inexperienced men may compose poetries with many faults, but because it contains glorification of the Lord, great personalities read it, hear it, and chant it. Despite its minute literary discrepancies, one must study poetry on the merit of its subject matter. According to Vaishnava philosophy, any literature that glorifies the Lord, whether properly written or not, is first class. There need be no other considerations. The poetic compositions of Bhavabhuti or Shrikantha, including Malati Madhav, Uttar Charita, Veera Charita, and many similar Sanskrit dramas. This great poet was born during the time of Bhojraj as the son of Nilakantha. A Brahman. Kalidas flourished during the time of Maharaj Vikramaditya and he became the state poet. He composed some 30 or 40 Sanskrit dramas, including Kumar Sambhav, Abhigyan Shakuntalam, and Meghdut. His drama Raghuvamsh is especially famous. We have already described Jayadev in chapter 13 of the Adi Lila. Verse number 103. Shaishav chapale kichu na labe amar shishera samana muni na han tomar. I am not even fit to be a disciple, therefore kindly do not take seriously whatever childish impudence I have shown. Verse 104. Ajivas yaha kali miliba abar shuniba tomar mukhe shastrera vichar. Please go back home and tomorrow we may meet again so that I may hear discourses on the Shastras from your mouth. Verse 105. E mate nij ghare gela dui jana kavi ratre kaila Saraswati aradhana. In this way both the poet and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went back to their homes, and at night the poet worshipped Mother Saraswati. Verse 106. Saraswati swapne tanre upadesha kaila sakshat ishwara kari prabhu ke janila. In a dream, the goddess informed him of the Lord's position, and the poetic champion could understand that Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. Verse 107. Prate asi Prabhu pade la ilas sharana Prabhu kripa kaila tandra khandila bandhana. The next morning, the poet came to Lord Chaitanya and surrendered unto his lotus feet. The Lord bestowed his mercy upon him and cut off all his bondage to material attachment. Purport. In the same process advocated by Lord Sri Krishna in his teachings of the Bhagavad Gita as it is, surrender unto me in all instances was advocated by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The champion surrendered unto the Lord, and the Lord favored him. One who is favored by the Lord is freed from material bondage, as stated in the Bhagavad Gita 4.9, Tyaktva deham punarjanma naiti mam eti so Arjuna. Verse 108. Bhagyavanta digvijay safala jivana vidya bale paila Mahaprabhura Charana. The poetic champion was certainly most fortunate. His life was successful by dint of his vast learning and erudite scholarship, and thus he attained the shelter of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Purport. Sri Narottam Das Thakur has sung that the best qualification for taking shelter of the lotus feet of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is to be most fallen, because the Lord came specifically to deliver the fallen souls. In this age, there are very few scholars. Almost everyone is a fallen meat eater, drunkard, woman hunter, or gambler. Such persons are never considered learned scholars, even if they pose as such. Because these so-called scholars superficially see that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu associates with the fallen souls, they think that he is meant for a lower class of men, but they do not need him. Thus, such scholars do not take to Krishna consciousness movement. To be puffed up with false learning, therefore, is a disqualification for accepting the Krishna consciousness movement. But there is a special example, for although the poetic champion was a greatly learned scholar, the Lord also favored him because of his humble submission. Verse 109. Esaba lila varniyachena Vrindavan Das ye kichu vishesha iha karela prakash. Shri Vrindavan Das Thakur has described all these incidents elaborately. I have only presented the specific incidents he has not described. Verse 110. Chaitanya Gosanira Lila Amrite Radhar Sarvendriya Tripta Hai Shravane Yahar. The nectarian drops of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's pastimes can satisfy the senses of everyone who hears them. Verse 111. Shri Rupa Raghunath Pade Yar Asha Chaitanya Charitamrita Kahe Krishnadas. Praying at the lotus feet of Shri Rupa and Raghunath, always desiring their mercy, I, Krishnadas, narrate Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita following in their footsteps. Purport. Thus end the Bhaktivedanta purports to Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Lila 16th chapter, describing the pastimes of the Lord in his childhood and youth. And tomorrow we will commence from the 17th chapter. Thank you for joining. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki